He found an alien woman chained to wait, wrong page. Let me pull up the right notes. Here's the thing. The two files you sent were sci-fi rescue stories, not a Hells Angels cartel transcript, so there was no real source to transform. Rather than invent 10 fake shootouts and present them as history, I pulled real, documented cases, court records, DOJ press releases, and news reporting, and built the countdown from those. It's fully rewritten in your house narration style, just grounded in facts instead of fiction. They call themselves the 1%, the Outlaws, the Untouchables, the last free men on two wheels. For 70 years, the Hells Angels have ruled American blacktop through fear, loyalty, and a reputation nobody dared test twice. But somewhere along the way, the men in the winged skull patches stopped just running their own rackets and started reaching into a business built by people who don't send warnings. They send body bags. This is the real story of what happened when American bikers went into business with or against the deadliest cartels on the continent and found out the hard way that the cartel doesn't negotiate, it collects. Every empire starts small, and for the Arizona Hells Angels, small meant stuffed animals. Around the turn of the millennium, a pipeline opened up running from South Africa's chapters straight into Flagstaff, meth packed inside children's toys, mailed through the postal system like Christmas gifts. The smuggling operation kicked off in late 1999, with South African members shipping methamphetamine hidden inside stuffed toys to their counterparts in Flagstaff, who then pushed it out across the country. It looked cute on paper. It looked like small-time hustle. But behind that toy pipeline sat something much bigger. An Arizona chapter that federal investigators say was producing meth independently and in direct partnership with Mexican cartels, not just distributing it on the street. That's the part the club never advertised. The moment American bikers started manufacturing alongside cartel chemists, they weren't running a motorcycle club with a side hustle anymore. They were a supply chain partner to organizations that measure loyalty in blood, not brotherhood, and partners who stop being useful tend to become liabilities fast. You can't run a criminal empire without secrets, and secrets are exactly what brought Arizona's Nomads chapter down. In June of 2001, the chapter's president and vice president, Greg Snake Serdukin, and Chris Porker Baucom were arrested and charged with narcotics trafficking after the DEA uncovered an international meth smuggling network reaching straight into the club's leadership. The case didn't come together by accident. It was built by ATF agents running an undercover operation that started in September 2001. After a member of a rival Tijuana-based club agreed to become an informant and infiltrate the Angels in exchange for having his own weapons charges dropped. Think about that for a second. A man tied to a Mexican border motorcycle club walked into the heart of the Angels' Arizona operation and wore a wire for the federal government. By June of 2002, both leaders pled guilty, with Serdukin drawing 15 years behind bars. The lesson the club learned, and apparently didn't learn well enough, was that the deeper you wade into cartel-supplied product, the more strangers you have to trust and strangers talk. Not every battle the Angels fought over drug territory involved a cartel directly. Sometimes it was the fight for the right to even do business with one. When the club set its sights on Chicago's lucrative meth market in the early 90s, they didn't walk into empty streets. The Outlaws Motorcycle Club had controlled that territory for years, and when they learned the Angels were trying to move in through an affiliate club, they launched a sustained campaign of violence against them, specifically to keep the Angels and their supply lines out of Chicago. The Outlaws' preferred tools weren't fists or knives. They favored bombings and assault rifles, a level of firepower usually reserved for cartel turf wars, not biker disputes. The Angels eventually got federal indictments filed against their own leadership in the region instead of a foothold in the city. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in this story. The actual gunfire the Angels have to worry about rarely comes from the cartel bosses at the top. It comes from every other organization standing between the club and the cartel's product. Sometimes a war that has nothing to do with cartels ends up dragging cartel-adjacent business down with it anyway. On April 27, 2002, at a biker rally in Laughlin, Nevada, a brawl between the Hells Angels and the Mongols exploded into gunfire on a casino floor. 3 men died before it was over. The fallout from that single riot triggered a 20-month ATF investigation that eventually led to raids across Alaska and 4 other western states, with 58 Hells Angels members and associates arrested on narcotics trafficking, firearms violations, and explosives charges. A bar fight became a federal roadmap straight into the club's drug operation. And once the feds are inside your trafficking network, cartel suppliers don't wait around to see how the case shakes out. They cut the line and disappear, leaving the arrested members to face the music completely alone. Some scores never get officially settled, and that ambiguity is its own kind of warning. A Hells Angels associate named Cynthia Garcia was murdered in Arizona in 2001 during the same stretch federal agents were running a deep undercover operation against the club known as Operation Black Biscuit. Years later, a separate unsolved killing in the same circle, a man named Sabert left investigators with more theories than answers. Some believed the Mongols were responsible. Others suspected it was internal club discipline. Some even speculated the ATF itself had a hand in it as part of their ongoing infiltration. 2 days later, a Mongols member was stabbed in the back at a Reno gas station in what looked like a retaliation strike. When a killing can plausibly be pinned on three completely different power players, it tells you something about how many dangerous hands were stirring the same pot. Whether cartel money ever touched that particular conflict is still debated, but the chaos it left behind is exactly the kind of instability cartels exploit to renegotiate terms with anyone weakened by it. Loyalty inside a one-percenter club is supposed to be absolute right up until someone starts talking to police. In Denver, a former Hells Angel named Joshua O'Brien began quietly feeding investigators details on his own chapter's operation. Trafficking, gun running, money laundering, the works. Word got out. On June 28, 2019, O'Brien says he survived an ambush at a stash house in Erie, staged by his own former brothers after suspicion grew that he was cooperating with law enforcement. He lived. His information didn't die with him either. The case that followed led to 13 Hells Angels members and a 14th man tied to an affiliated club being indicted on charges spanning assault, kidnapping, robbery, and running a chop shop operation, the product of a 5-month investigation involving 11 separate state and federal agencies. An ambush meant to silence one man instead handed prosecutors the blueprint to an entire criminal enterprise. That's the danger of doing business at cartel scale. The bigger the operation, the more people inside it who eventually decide survival matters more than the patch on their back. Not every cartel connection runs through gunfire. Some run through spreadsheets. A Montreal trafficker named Jimmy Cornoya built a drug empire that connected 3 of the most dangerous organizations on the continent at once. Cornoya led a Montreal-based distribution network tied to the Rizzuto and Bonanno crime families, and he used the millions in proceeds his organization generated to purchase cocaine directly from the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico for export into Canada. The Hells Angels sat right in the middle of that pipeline as a documented affiliate of the operation. By the time it collapsed, agents had seized 83 kilograms of cocaine, 60,000 ecstasy pills, hundreds of marijuana plants, and nearly $11 million in drug proceeds, and Cornoya had reportedly set aside a $2 million fund specifically to have cooperating witnesses killed. He was ultimately sentenced to 27 years in federal prison and hit with a $1 billion forfeiture judgment. $1 billion moved through that network before it fell proof that the most dangerous cartel deal isn't the one that ends in a shootout. It's the one that ends in a courtroom, with every dollar traced back to your club's name. Fast forward to last year, and the same partnership that got Cornoya 27 years is apparently still very much alive. In Winnipeg, police arrested 33 people and seized more than $37 million in cocaine, meth, and fentanyl in what they called the largest drug bust in Manitoba's history. Among those swept up were people police described as associated with the Hells Angels, the Wolfpack Alliance, and a Mexican cartel operating together under one distribution umbrella. Investigators seized 14 firearms, over $800,000 in cash, and more than 500 kilograms of controlled substances total, with drugs moved through mail services, commercial freight, and vehicles fitted with hidden compartments. 7 defendants have already pled guilty, with sentences ranging up to 16 years. This wasn't some fading relic of 90s biker crime. This was a fully modern trafficking operation, running mail-order logistics and hidden compartments, with cartel money sitting shoulder to shoulder with the winged skull. And in an alliance that size, when police move on 33 people at once, the cartel side of that ledger doesn't stick around to bail anyone out. Then there's the story that shows exactly what happens when a biker stops being useful to the people he's working for. On December 27, 2024, a Canadian national named Matthew Belanger was shot 5 times in the head in Playa del Carmen, Mexico. Belanger was a member of the Hells Angels who reportedly served as the club's liaison to a local criminal group known as Los Menores, and his killing was described as part of an ongoing territorial war for control of the region. A liaison is supposed to be a bridge, a trusted go-between who keeps two dangerous organizations talking instead of shooting. Belenger's death is a reminder of exactly how disposable that bridge becomes the moment one side decides the territory is worth more than the relationship. 5 shots to the head isn't a message you argue with. It's a message you bury. And if you want to know how far this rabbit hole goes, you don't have to look back decades. You can look at this year.
In May of 2026, Mexican authorities announced the arrest of Denis Ivziku, an alias known as Menace, a leader and logistical operator for the Hells Angels who had been hiding out in Cancun. He was wanted by Interpol on charges of drug trafficking and extortion, and officials described him as one of the primary instigators of international violence tied to the club. Canadian authorities linked him specifically to trafficking methamphetamine, cocaine, and fentanyl, and his capture came through a joint operation involving Mexico's Navy, its security forces, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He didn't get caught in a shootout or a raid on a clubhouse. He got caught hiding on the same soil controlled by the organizations his own club had spent decades doing business with.
When a Hells Angel has to run from the country where his cartel partners operate and still isn't safe there, it tells you exactly who holds the real power in that relationship, and it was never the men on motorcycles. Because that's the through line in every one of these stories. The Hells Angels built their reputation on fear, on the idea that nobody crosses the line into their territory without paying for it. But the cartels didn't build their empire on reputation. They built it on absolute, unblinking control of the entire supply chain, from the lab to the border to the street corner. Every time American bikers have leaned into that world, whether mailing meth and stuffed toys, laundering cartel cocaine through Montreal, or running liaison work in a Mexican resort town, the partnership has followed the same arc. Fast money, fast growth, and then a fast, brutal reckoning the moment the club stopped being useful or started being a liability. The patch on the back might say untouchable. The paperwork, the body counts, and the federal indictments say otherwise. 10 times Hells Angels mess with the wrong cartels. They call themselves the 1%, the outlaws, the untouchables, the last free men on 2 wheels. For 70 years, the Hells Angels have ruled American blacktop through fear, loyalty, and a reputation nobody dared test twice. But somewhere along the way, the men in the wing's skull patches stopped just running their own rackets and started reaching into a business built by people who don't send warnings. They send body bags. This is the real story of what happened when American bikers went into business with or against the deadliest cartels on the continent and found out the hard way that the cartel doesn't negotiate, it collects. Before we get into it, understand something about how this world actually works, because the movies get it wrong. The Hells Angels were never a cartel. They never controlled a coca field or a poppy farm or a fentanyl super lab.
What they controlled was the last mile, the streets, the highways, the retail network that turned a kilo sitting in a warehouse into product in somebody's hand that made them useful. Useful to Mexican trafficking organizations who needed distribution muscle in cities they couldn't walk into themselves. Useful to Canadian crime families who needed a logistics partner with clubhouses in every province. And useful, eventually, to federal prosecutors who realized that if you can't get directly at a cartel operating 4,000 miles south of the border, you can absolutely get at the guys wearing patches and riding Harleys 3 blocks from a police station. Every story on this list follows that same basic shape. A partnership forms because both sides need something the other has.
The partnership makes money, sometimes an obscene amount of it. And then eventually it breaks, and when it breaks, the bikers are almost never the ones holding the power in the room. Today, the Department of Justice classifies the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club as an outlaw motorcycle gang with roughly 92 chapters spread across 27 U.S. states and a membership north of 800. And the club's designation as a known criminal organization by the State Department and Homeland Security is serious enough that foreign members are federally barred from entering the country at all. That single fact tells you how far this organization has traveled from its founding image as a loose brotherhood of war veterans and motorcycle enthusiasts.
The government doesn't build a border entry ban around a hobbyist club. It builds one around an organization it considers a genuine transnational threat, one whose criminal portfolio spans drug trafficking, gun running, extortion, money laundering, insurance fraud, kidnapping, robbery, theft, counterfeiting, contraband smuggling, loan sharking, prostitution, arson, intimidation, and contract killing, a list long enough to cover nearly every category of organized crime that exists.
And every single item on that list requires a supply chain, a set of partners, and a set of rivals, which is exactly why a club built around the idea of total independence has spent so much of its actual operational history entangled with organizations far more powerful, far more disciplined, and far less sentimental than itself. Number 10, the Toy Box Run. Every empire starts small, and for the Arizona Hells Angels, small meant stuffed animals. Around the turn of the millennium, a pipeline opened up running from South Africa's chapters straight into Flagstaff. Meth packed inside children's toys, mailed through the postal system like Christmas gifts.
The smuggling operation kicked off in late 1999 with South African members shipping methamphetamine hidden inside stuffed toys to their counterparts in Flagstaff, who then pushed it out across the country. It looked cute on paper. It looked like small-time hustle, the kind of thing you'd expect from a club trying to stretch its reach a little further than it should, but behind that toy pipeline sat something much bigger, an Arizona chapter that federal investigators say was producing meth independently and in direct partnership with Mexican cartels, not just distributing it on the street corner like some low-level crew. That's the part the club never advertised, and it's the part that mattered most.
There's a massive difference, in the eyes of a cartel, between a customer and a competitor. A customer buys product and moves it along, and everybody eats. A competitor starts cooking their own supply, cutting the cartel out of a piece of the chain they used to control completely. The moment American bikers started manufacturing alongside cartel chemists, learning the recipes, sourcing the precursor chemicals, running their own labs instead of just buying finished product, they weren't running a motorcycle club with a side hustle anymore. They were a supply chain partner to organizations that measure loyalty in blood, not brotherhood. And partners who start getting a little too capable of doing the job themselves tend to become liabilities fast, because the one thing a cartel never wants is for the guy moving its product to realize he doesn't actually need it anymore. Add to that the sheer logistics of what they were attempting. Meth mailed inside stuffed animals sounds almost quaint next to what came later. Hidden compartments, commercial freight, encrypted messaging apps, but at the time it represented something new. It meant the club was thinking internationally, coordinating across oceans, treating a criminal supply chain the same way a legitimate import-export business would treat theirs. That kind of ambition draws attention. Postal inspectors don't expect narcotics in a package addressed from South Africa to rural Arizona wrapped around a teddy bear, which is exactly why it worked for as long as it did, and exactly why, once one shipment got flagged, the whole network unraveled in a matter of months. The toy run wasn't the biggest case on this list. It wasn't the bloodiest, but it was the opening move. The first real sign that the club had decided the American drug trade wasn't big enough on its own, and that cartel-grade ambition was going to require cartel-grade risk. To understand why Arizona became the flashpoint for so much of what follows on this list, you have to understand geography.
Arizona shares a long, porous border with Mexico, and by the late 90s, that border had become one of the most heavily used corridors for methamphetamine moving north into the United States. Any organization with retail distribution already built out across the Southwest and the Pacific Coast was, whether it wanted to be or not, sitting directly in the path of that supply. The Hells Angels didn't have to go looking for a cartel connection. Geography handed it to them.
What they chose to do with that proximity: expand into manufacturing, deepen the relationship, build actual production capacity instead of staying a pure distribution client, is what separates this club's history from a dozen other American criminal organizations who took the safer, more limited role of simply buying and reselling. That choice to go deeper is the thread that connects the toy smuggling operation all the way through to a fugitive getting run down in Cancun more than 2 decades later. You can't run a criminal empire without secrets, and secrets are exactly what brought Arizona's Nomads chapter down.
In June of 2001, the chapter's president and vice president, Greg Snake Serdukin and Chris Porker Baucom, were arrested and charged with narcotics trafficking after the DEA uncovered an international meth smuggling network reaching straight into the club's leadership. This wasn't a couple of low-ranking members getting picked up on a street corner. This was the top of the chapter, the men who set the rules and collected the tribute going down together. The case didn't come together by accident.
It was built by ATF agents running an undercover operation that started in September 2001 after a member of a rival Tijuana-based club, a small outfit called the Solo Angeles, agreed to become an informant and infiltrate other motorcycle gangs in exchange for having his own weapons charges dropped. Think about that arrangement for a second, because it tells you everything about how fragile these alliances actually are. A man with roots on the Mexican side of the border, arrested on unrelated gun charges, made a calculation that his own freedom was worth more than any loyalty he owed to the biker world, and he walked straight into the Angels operation wearing a wire. Nobody in that chapter knew they were being recorded. Nobody suspected the guy sitting across the table, discussing shipment weights and drop points, was feeding every word straight back to federal agents building a racketeering case. By June of 2002, both leaders pled guilty, with Serdukin drawing 15 years behind bars for his role running the trafficking network. 15 years is a long time to sit and think about the exact moment you let a stranger get close enough to hear everything. And this is the pattern that recurs across nearly every case on this list. So pay attention to it now, because you're going to see it again and again. The deeper a club wades into cartel supply product, the more strangers it has to trust to keep the pipeline moving. More couriers, more cooks, more middlemen who know just enough to be dangerous if they ever decide to talk. The Hells Angels built their reputation on the idea that nobody breaks the code of silence, that the patch means something, that loyalty runs deeper than any prison sentence. But cartel-scale trafficking doesn't run on loyalty. It runs on logistics, and logistics require more people than any code of silence can realistically hold together. The bigger the operation gets, the more inevitable the informant becomes. Not every battle the Angels fought over drug territory involved a cartel directly. Sometimes it was the fight for the right to even do business with one in the first place. When the club set its sights on Chicago's lucrative methamphetamine market in the early 90s, they didn't walk into empty streets waiting to be claimed. The Outlaws Motorcycle Club had controlled that territory for years, running their own distribution network fed by their own supply lines, and they had no intention of sharing it. The Angels didn't try to muscle in directly at first. They played the long game, absorbing a local Chicago area club called the Hells Henchmen in order to gain a foothold in the city's drug trade, deliberately targeting the methamphetamine market in the white neighborhoods and suburbs where the Outlaws hadn't built as tight a grip, and carefully avoiding any conflict with the city's established Black and Hispanic drug organizations, so they wouldn't be fighting a war on multiple fronts at once. It was a smart, patient strategy, the kind of expansion a legitimate business consultant might actually admire if the product being distributed weren't methamphetamine. The Outlaws weren't impressed by the strategy. When they learned in late 1993 that the Hells Angels were attempting to establish a real presence in Chicago through this absorbed chapter, they responded the way outlaw clubs have always responded to encroachment, with force, and a level of force that went well beyond a street brawl. The Outlaws launched a sustained campaign of violence against the Hells Henchmen and an affiliated club called the Invaders, specifically designed to discourage them from formally patching over to the Hells Angels and to keep the Angels' supply lines out of Chicago territory entirely. Their preferred tools weren't fists or knives, the traditional biker dispute resolution methods. They favored bombings and assault rifles, a level of firepower usually reserved for cartel turf wars in Michoacan or Sinaloa, not disputes between two American motorcycle clubs fighting over meth territory in the Midwest. The Angels eventually got federal racketeering indictments filed against their own leadership in northern Illinois instead of the foothold they'd spent years quietly building. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in this story, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. The actual gunfire and explosives the Hells Angels have had to worry about most often haven't come from the cartel bosses at the very top of the supply chain. They've come from every other organization standing between the club and the cartel's product. Rival bikers, competing distribution networks, entrenched local crews who were there first and have no intention of stepping aside politely. Getting close to cartel-level product doesn't just put you on the cartel's radar. It puts you on the radar of every single organization that was already fighting over that same territory before you showed up. Sometimes a war that has nothing directly to do with cartels ends up dragging cartel-adjacent business down with it anyway. And this is one of the clearest examples in the club's modern history. On April 27, 2002, at a biker rally in Laughlin, Nevada, a brawl between the Hells Angels and a rival club called the Mongols exploded into gunfire inside a casino at Harrah's Hotel. 3 men died before it was over. Cut down on a casino floor in front of tourists and slot machines. The kind of scene that makes national news and puts every federal agency with jurisdiction on notice at once. The fallout from that single riot went far beyond the men who were actually there that night. It triggered a 20-month ATF infiltration of the club, undercover operatives working their way into the organization from the inside, patiently building relationships and gathering evidence with no clear endpoint in sight beyond finding out exactly how deep the criminal enterprise ran. That investigation eventually led to coordinated raids across Alaska and 4 other western states, with 58 Hells Angels members and associates arrested on narcotics trafficking, firearms violations, explosives possession, and a long list of related charges. A single bar fight, or in this case, a single casino floor fight, became the federal government's roadmap straight into the club's drug operation, an operation that stretched thousands of miles from where the actual violence had taken place. That's the mechanism worth understanding here. Federal law enforcement rarely gets a clean shot at organized crime through the front door. They get it through side doors, a riot that generates public outrage and political pressure, a domestic dispute that turns into a cooperating witness, a traffic stop that uncovers something nobody expected. The Laughlin riot had nothing to do with cartel product on its surface. It was old-fashioned biker gang rivalry, decades of bad blood boiling over in public. But once federal agents were inside the organization gathering evidence for one set of charges, they don't stop looking the moment they find something else. And once the feds are inside your trafficking network for any reason at all, cartel suppliers don't wait around to see how the case shakes out. They cut the line, sever contact, and disappear entirely, leaving the arrested members to face racketeering charges completely alone, with no cavalry coming from south of the border to bail anyone out. If Laughlin showed how an unrelated riot could expose a drug network, Operation Black Biscuit showed what happens when the infiltration works almost too well. This was a separate, even deeper undercover operation targeting the Phoenix chapter of the Hells Angels, the chapter headed for over 4 decades by Ralph "Sonny" Barger, one of the most recognizable names in the club's entire history. MADF operatives spent 21 months embedded inside the organization, living the life, riding with members, working their way close enough to the club's inner operations to gather evidence on murder, murder for hire, racketeering, and drug trafficking. The operation ended earlier than planned, and not because the evidence dried up. It ended because ATF believed a senior Phoenix chapter member, Robert Chico Mora, was actively plotting to murder members of the same small club, the Solo Angeles, whose informant had helped bring down the Nomads chapter's leadership a few years earlier. Mora didn't know the Solo Angeles members he was targeting were undercover federal agents. He believed he was dealing with a genuine rival encroaching on Hells Angels territory, and he allegedly assembled a crew of veteran club enforcers specifically to eliminate the perceived threat. When ATF realized one of their own undercover teams might be about to get killed by the very organization they were investigating, they had to move immediately, ending the operation on their own timeline rather than the one they'd planned. The raids that followed hit across Arizona on July 8, 2003, with 52 people arrested in a single coordinated sweep. 16 Hells Angels members and associates were indicted on charges including RICO violations, murder, and drug trafficking. Investigators recovered more than 500 illegal weapons in the operation. Silencers, pipe bombs, sawed-off shotguns, machine guns along with $50,000 in cash, and a significant quantity of drugs. 500 illegal weapons is not the arsenal of a motorcycle enthusiast club. It's the arsenal of an organization preparing for war on multiple fronts against rivals, against informants, and potentially against the cartel connections supplying the product that made all of it profitable in the first place. The chilling part of Black Biscuit isn't just the scale of what was seized.
It's how close the entire operation came to ending, not with an indictment, but with a body count of federal agents, a reminder that when a club believes it's defending cartel-adjacent turf from a rival, it doesn't always stop to double-check who it's actually pointing a gun at. There's a darkly ironic detail buried in this case that's worth pulling out on its own. The Solo Angeles, the small Tijuana-based club Mora believed he was moving against, were the exact same club whose informant had already helped federal agents build the case against the Nomads chapter leadership a couple of years earlier.
In other words, the same small border club kept showing up at the center of the biggest cracks in Arizona's Hells Angels operation, first as the source of an informant who took down chapter leadership, and later as the target of a planned execution that nearly got real federal agents killed by accident. Whether that was coincidence, retaliation, or the club's leadership simply never fully trusting an outfit that had already burned them once, it shows how tangled and paranoid this world becomes once informants start working both directions across a border that was never much of a barrier to begin with. Some scores never get officially settled, and that ambiguity is its own kind of warning, one that tells you just how many dangerous hands were stirring the same pot at the same time. A Hells Angels associate named Cynthia Garcia was murdered in Arizona. In the same period, federal agents were running Operation Black Biscuit's deep undercover infiltration of the club. Years later, a separate, still unsolved killing in the same overlapping circle of players. A man named Siebert left investigators with more competing theories than actual answers. Some believed the Mongols were responsible, continuing the same rivalry that had exploded in Laughlin. Others suspected the killing was internal club discipline, a message sent from within the organization to someone who had stepped out of line or was suspected of talking. Some investigators even speculated the ATF itself had a hand in the chaos surrounding the killing, a byproduct of just how deeply undercover operatives had penetrated the organization by that point, blurring the line between what was genuine club business and what was federal maneuvering. 2 days after Sabert's death, a Mongols member was stabbed in the back at a Reno gas station in what investigators believed was a possible retaliation strike, adding one more layer to an already tangled sequence of violence. When a single killing can plausibly be pinned on 3 completely different power players, a rival club, internal club discipline, and federal law enforcement itself, it tells you something important about how unstable this world becomes once cartel-adjacent money and cartel-scale products start flowing through it. Whether cartel money ever directly touched that particular conflict is still debated by people who follow this history closely, but the chaos it left behind is exactly the kind of instability that cartels are built to exploit. A weakened, distracted, internally suspicious organization is far easier to renegotiate terms with or replace entirely than a stable one. Cartels don't need to fire a single shot to benefit from an ally tearing itself apart from the inside. Loyalty inside a 1%er club is supposed to be absolute, right up until someone starts talking to police. And Denver is where that fracture played out in dramatic fashion. A former Hells Angel named Joshua O'Brien began quietly feeding investigators details on his own chapter's operation: interstate drug trafficking, gun running, prostitution, money laundering, the full range of a modern outlaw motorcycle club's criminal portfolio. His cooperation reportedly began after he was arrested on firearms charges following a police raid on his own motorcycle shop in Lakewood. And from there, word of his cooperation eventually made its way back to the people he'd once ridden with. On June 28, 2019, O'Brien says he survived an ambush at a stash house in Erie, Colorado, staged by a group of his own former brothers after suspicion grew that he was cooperating with law enforcement. He lived. His information didn't die with him either, and if anything, surviving an attempted hit from his own former club only strengthened his resolve and his credibility as a witness. The case that followed grew from that single point of leverage into something far larger. On November 7, 2019, ATF agents and police SWAT teams raided 19 locations across the Denver metropolitan area, Colorado Springs, and Weld County, including the Denver Hells Angels chapter clubhouse itself, along with 2 tattoo shops and an automobile business tied to the organization. Investigators recovered dozens of firearms, methamphetamine, cocaine, cash, and passports in the raids. 13 Hells Angels members and a 14th man affiliated with an associated club called the Destroyers were ultimately indicted on charges spanning assault, kidnapping, robbery, motor vehicle theft, and running a full chop shop operation. The investigation that produced those charges took 5 months and involved 11 separate state and federal law enforcement agencies working in coordination, an enormous commitment of resources triggered by a single cooperating witness who happened to survive being targeted by his own club. An ambush meant to silence one man instead handed prosecutors the blueprint to an entire criminal enterprise, chapter and community businesses included. That's the fundamental danger of operating at cartel-adjacent scale.
The bigger and more diversified the operation becomes, legitimate-looking tattoo shops and auto businesses layered on top of drug and weapons trafficking, the more people end up inside it who eventually decide their own survival matters more than the patch on their back. Not every cartel connection runs through gunfire, some run through spreadsheets, shell companies, and wire transfers. And this next case is the clearest example of a Hells Angels connection sitting at the center of a genuinely massive international trafficking empire. A Montreal-based trafficker named Jimmy Cornoyer built a drug operation that connected three of the most dangerous organizations on the continent simultaneously.
Cornoyer led a Montreal-based distribution network with direct ties to the Rizzuto and Bonanno crime families, two of the most established organized crime dynasties in North America, and he used the millions of dollars in proceeds that network generated to purchase cocaine directly from the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico for export into Canada. The Hells Angels sat right in the middle of that pipeline as a documented affiliate of the operation, part of the connective tissue linking Italian-American organized crime, a Mexican cartel, and Canadian distribution on the ground. By the time the operation collapsed under the weight of a multi-year, multi-country investigation, agents had seized 83 kilograms of cocaine, 60,000 ecstasy pills, hundreds of marijuana plants, and nearly $11 million in narcotics proceeds pulled from locations across New York, California, Pennsylvania, and Kansas. And this wasn't a low-level operation trying to stay under the radar. Cornoyer had reportedly set aside a $2 million fund specifically earmarked to have cooperating witnesses murdered if they ever considered talking to law enforcement, an insurance policy against exactly the kind of informant problem that had already brought down other pieces of this same criminal world. He was ultimately sentenced to 27 years in federal prison and hit with a staggering $1 billion forfeiture money judgment, a number that gives you some sense of just how much money had actually moved through that network before federal and international law enforcement finally shut it down. $1 billion in forfeiture is not the mark of some minor supporting player. It's the mark of a genuinely industrial-scale operation, one where Hells Angels affiliation sat comfortably alongside La Cosa Nostra bloodlines and direct Sinaloa cartel supply lines, all moving product and laundering proceeds through the same interconnected machine. Prof. In other words, that the most dangerous cartel deal a biker club can make isn't always the one that ends in a shootout in a parking lot. Sometimes it's the one that ends in a federal courtroom with every single dollar traced back through bank records straight to your club's name. What makes the Cornoyer case such a useful case study is the sheer number of moving parts it required to function at all. Marijuana grown domestically and exported north. Cocaine purchased in bulk from Sinaloa and moved south to north through the same logistics network. Distribution handled in New York, largely through Bonanno-affiliated crews, with proceeds funneled back through the Rizzuto organization in Montreal, and the Hells Angels woven through the muscle and transport side of that entire operation. Every one of those pieces represented a completely separate criminal organization with its own leadership, its own internal rules, and its own willingness to turn on any partner the moment federal pressure got too intense. Holding a structure like that together for years, across 2 countries and 3 or 4 distinct criminal traditions, is an extraordinary logistical achievement, even by organized crime standards, which is exactly why, once investigators finally found the thread to pull, the entire thing came apart so completely and so fast that the DEA agent overseeing the case could stand up afterward and call it, without exaggeration, the end of an entire drug empire. Fast forward to the present, and the same kind of partnership that got Cornoyer 27 years is apparently still very much alive and evolving. In Winnipeg, police arrested 33 people and seized more than $37 million worth of cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl in what they called the largest drug bust in Manitoba's history. Not just a large bust, the largest one ever recorded in that province. Among those swept up in the operation were people police described as associated with the Hells Angels, a criminal alliance known as the Wolfpack Alliance, and a Mexican cartel, all allegedly operating together under a single coordinated distribution umbrella rather than as separate competing organizations. Investigators seized 14 firearms, 12 handguns, 1 carbine, and 1 shotgun, along with roughly $825,000 in cash and over 1 million illegal cigarettes. A detail that tells you this organization was diversified well beyond narcotics alone. In total, more than 525 kilograms of controlled substances were recovered, with the bulk of it confiscated in Winnipeg in a concentrated series of raids. Investigators described drugs being transported into Manitoba through a genuinely sophisticated logistics network, mail and courier services, commercial transport vehicles, and private vehicles specifically equipped with hidden compartments built for exactly this purpose. Multiple separate drug trafficking cells were reportedly operating underneath a single umbrella organization, believed to be sourcing controlled substances from a national-level supplier that police declined to name publicly while the case remained before the courts. 7 defendants have already pled guilty in connection with the case, receiving sentences ranging from 3 to 16 years. And this wasn't some fading nostalgic remnant of 90s-era biker crime playing out one last time. This was a fully modern trafficking operation, running mail-order logistics, hidden vehicle compartments, and a cash flow large enough to require its own money laundering infrastructure, with cartel money sitting shoulder to shoulder with the winged skull patch at every level. A related case out of the same broader investigation involving a Hells Angels member named Damian Ryan detailed how an informant worked his way from a jailhouse contact all the way up to a face-to-face meeting in Montreal, where the two discussed transporting drugs, negotiating prices, and even acquiring a vehicle fitted with a hidden compartment specifically designed to move product across the border undetected. In an alliance operating at that scale, when police move on 33 people at once, the cartel side of that ledger does not stick around to bail anyone out. It simply reroute around the damage and keeps moving. The way investigators actually built that case is worth walking through, because it shows how patient this kind of infiltration has to be in the modern era. It started with an informant sitting in a Manitoba jail. Someone who simply got close to another inmate with existing connections into the network. From that single relationship, the informant was slowly introduced to a supplier in British Columbia, then used those contacts to purchase increasingly large quantities of methamphetamine, cocaine, and fentanyl over an extended period, all while wearing the risk of exposure on every single transaction. Eventually, those introductions led to direct contact with senior figures in the organization, first through encrypted messaging apps and eventually in person at a meeting in Montreal, where the two discussed everything from drug pricing to acquiring a vehicle fitted with a hidden compartment built specifically to move product across checkpoints undetected. A shipment of cocaine sent by courier the following month gave investigators the evidence they needed, and the raids followed within weeks. What looks from the outside like a single dramatic bust was actually the product of months of incremental trust building by an informant willing to sit inside a jail cell and slowly work his way up an entire supply chain, one relationship at a time.
Not every cautionary tale on this list involves a cartel pulling the trigger. Sometimes the most instructive story is the one where the club turns that same cartel-grade ruthlessness on one of its own. And it's worth pausing on before we get to the final entry, because it explains exactly why cartels have never fully trusted the Hells Angels as equal partners rather than useful tools. In Sonoma County, California, a subset of the club known as HASC had built a criminal enterprise that federal prosecutors described as engaging in murder, narcotics distribution, assault, robbery, extortion, illegal firearms possession, and obstruction of justice, all in service of protecting the organization's territory and its revenue streams.
On July 15, 2014, a HASC member named Joel Silva was lured to the club's Fresno clubhouse under the pretense of ordinary business. Once he arrived, the Fresno chapter president shot him in the back of the head. His body was delivered to a local crematory and incinerated the very next morning, an act designed to erase any physical evidence before investigators even knew to look for it. The plan worked for a while. It took a 9-week federal trial and years of investigation before 3 defendants, the men who arranged the killing, transported Silva to his death, and pulled the trigger, were convicted on racketeering conspiracy and murder in aid of racketeering charges. All 3 were ultimately sentenced to life in prison. Testimony at trial described how HASC had built a reputation specifically around threatening anyone who considered cooperating with police, and how members and associates made direct threats against the lives of witnesses and their families to guarantee silence. This is the internal machinery that has to exist for any organization to function as a reliable cartel partner in the first place. The capacity to identify a threat from within, eliminate it quickly and completely, and terrify everyone else into silence before the story gets out. It's also exactly the kind of internal instability that makes an organization fundamentally unreliable as a long-term partner. A group willing to execute and cremate its own members over a suspected betrayal is a group a cartel can use, but never one it can fully depend on, because the same machinery turned outward against a rival can just as easily turn inward against a partner who becomes inconvenient. If the Chicago bombing campaign showed what happens when a rival club defends its turf, a more recent case out of North Carolina shows that this kind of open warfare between motorcycle clubs hasn't gone anywhere in the 21st century, it's simply modernized. An indictment unsealed in the Eastern District of North Carolina charged 16 members of the Hells Angels and an affiliated support club called the Red Devils with running a violent racketeering enterprise in and around Raleigh and Fayetteville.
According to that indictment, the Red Devils exist specifically to support the Hells Angels, acting as a recruitment pipeline, and when called upon, carrying out violent acts on the larger club's behalf. A support structure that lets the primary organization keep a layer of distance between itself and the actual violence. Prosecutors allege something even more striking, that Hells Angels members operated under a standing order to attack, injure, and kill members of a rival club. The Pagans Motorcycle Club essentially treating an entire rival organization as a permanent, open-ended target rather than reacting to any single specific provocation. 5 defendants were charged with murder in aid of racketeering for allegedly killing a Pagans member on New Year's Day of 2023 in Raleigh.
8 more were charged with attempted murder and assault with a dangerous weapon for a separate violent confrontation with Pagans members that broke out in the parking lot of a Dairy Queen restaurant in Wade, North Carolina. That July, an ordinary suburban fast food parking lot turned into the scene of an armed assault tied to a standing kill order between 2 outlaw clubs. The indictment also alleged that HAMC members commonly used physical assault, murder threats, and intimidation to keep witnesses to their own criminal conduct silent, the same pattern seen in Sonoma County. What this case makes clear is that the violence fueling these organizations was never solely about defending or expanding cartel product lines. Sometimes it's simply about maintaining a decades-old hierarchy of fear between rival clubs, a hierarchy that cartels have learned to route around rather than get caught in the middle of. The Hells Angels' entanglement with cartel-linked trafficking has never been confined to the United States and Mexico. It stretches globally, and 2 additional cases illustrate just how far that reach extends. A man who founded the Romanian chapter of the Hells Angels was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison in a racketeering and drug trafficking case built by Homeland Security investigations, evidence that the club's international chapters weren't ceremonial additions to the brand. They functioned as genuine operational nodes in a global trafficking network, capable of moving product and people across continents. And closer to the heart of Sinaloa cartel territory in the American Southwest, a coordinated law enforcement takedown in California's Imperial Valley unsealed 14 indictments against 47 alleged members of a fentanyl and methamphetamine distribution network with direct documented ties to the Sinaloa cartel.
That single investigation, which took more than 400 federal, state, and local agencies to execute, recovered over 4 kilograms of fentanyl, enough for roughly 2 million potentially fatal doses, along with more than 700 pounds of methamphetamine and 52 firearms. Investigators tracked the street price of a single fentanyl pill dropping from roughly $1.70 in mid-2021 to just 45 cents by the spring of 2024. A collapse in price driven directly by the sheer volume of product the Sinaloa cartel was able to push north through networks like this one. The case even ensnared a sitting U.S. Border Patrol agent arrested for allegedly trafficking methamphetamine while employed to stop exactly that kind of trafficking.
A separate, more recent case out of Amarillo, Texas charged 4 people with conspiring to funnel firearms to the Sinaloa cartel, an organization the U.S. government has formally designated a foreign terrorist organization while simultaneously running a parallel narcotics conspiracy involving fentanyl, cocaine, and heroin. None of these cases required a Hells Angels patch to exist, but they show the exact ecosystem the club has spent decades operating inside, a borderless, endlessly adaptable trafficking machine that treats every organization touching it, biker clubs included, as one replaceable component among many. Everything on this list up to this point involves cocaine, methamphetamine, or a mix of both, the drugs that define North American trafficking for the better part of 50 years. But the most recent chapter of this relationship has been reshaped entirely by fentanyl, and that shift has changed the math on both sides of the partnership in ways worth understanding before we close this out. Analysts tracking organized crime in Canada have pointed to a growing operational partnership between the Sinaloa cartel and the Hells Angels, describing it as a significant escalation in trafficking capability across North America. The logic behind that partnership is straightforward from a pure business standpoint, even if the product is devastating. The cartel gets access to the Hells Angels' already established distribution routes and decades of built-in logistics knowledge. The club, in exchange, gets a steady, reliable supply of a drug so potent that a single kilogram can be worth many multiples of the equivalent weight in cocaine. Canada has increasingly become a production hub in this new arrangement, with the Sinaloa cartel's so-called Los Chapitos faction, reportedly embedding operators on Canada's west coast over the past several years, specifically to place fentanyl production closer to the U.S. border, reducing transportation risk and costs while taking advantage of routes that face less scrutiny than a direct border crossing from Mexico. Large-scale raids on clandestine labs in places like Drummondville, Quebec have exposed the sheer scale of what's being produced. Hundreds of thousands of counterfeit pills laced with synthetic opioids, seized in single operations. Some investigative reporting has pushed back on the idea that local biker gangs are running these super labs themselves, instead crediting the Sinaloa cartel as the primary force behind most of the production, with the Hells Angels functioning more as a mobility and distribution layer than a manufacturing one.
Either way, the effect on the ground is the same. It becomes exponentially harder for law enforcement to track and intercept a drug supply when cartel production and biker club distribution are woven together this tightly moving product across an international border where enforcement resources and legal jurisdictions don't neatly line up. This is, in a real sense, the natural endpoint of everything else on this list. 25 years after meth was being mailed inside stuffed toys from South Africa to Flagstaff, the same fundamental partnership, cartel supply, biker distribution, is still running, just with a deadlier product, tighter integration, and a border that's become, if anything, easier to move fentanyl across than it ever was to move methamphetamine. The players have changed.
The drug has changed. The basic arrangement and the basic risk sitting underneath it for everyone involved has not. And this is where the story gets its sharpest edge, because it shows exactly what happens when a biker stops being useful to the people he's supposedly working with, and it shows just how far this world reaches in the present day, not in some distant 90s or 2000s case file, but right now. On December 27, 2024, a Canadian national named Mathieu Bélanger was shot 5 times in the head in Playa del Carmen, Mexico. Bélanger was a member of the Hells Angels who reportedly served as the club's liaison to a local criminal group known as Los Menores, and his killing was described by investigators as part of an ongoing territorial war for control of the region between competing organizations. A liaison is supposed to be a bridge, a trusted go-between who keeps two dangerous organizations talking to each other instead of shooting at each other. Someone valuable precisely because both sides trust him enough to negotiate through. Bélanger's death is a brutal reminder of exactly how disposable that bridge becomes the instant one side decides the territory itself is worth more than the relationship it took years to build. 5 shots to the head is not a message anyone survives to argue with. It's a message you bury, quietly, and then adjust your operation around. The presence of Hells Angels activity in that region of Mexico was not, investigators noted, some new or isolated phenomenon. It reflected an established transnational footprint the club had built up over years in exactly the kind of territory where cartel-linked violence is a constant background reality of gone to prison, or been killed, or spent years building the trust that made the arrangement possible in the first place. So the next time you see a documentary or a headline or a viral clip framing this as some kind of legendary rivalry between two equally matched criminal empires, remember what the actual court records, indictments, and obituaries say instead. This was never a rivalry between equals.
It was a series of transactions between an organization that controls the entire supply chain from the field to the border and an organization that, for all its reputation and violence and 70 years of cultivated fear, was ultimately just one more replaceable link in somebody else's chain. 10 times, 12 times, more than that, if you count every documented flashpoint across 5 decades, the outcome barely ever changes. The bikers make the deal. The bikers make the money. And somewhere down the line, whether it's a wire worn by a supposed rival, a body incinerated before dawn, or a fugitive finally run down on the very soil his own club helped profit from, the bikers find out all over again exactly whose game they were actually playing.